Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Communist Revolution in our continuing study of the history of civilizations. First, we need to go back to theories of economics, and of course, the big name that comes to mind is Adam Smith, when in 1776 he published his book, The Wealth of Nations. Some of the principles that he set forth, first of all, the principle of supply and demand, in which he pointed out that money really in itself has no intrinsic value. You can't eat it, you can't shave with it, you can't build with it. It actually has only the value that we place upon it. And the more of it there is, the less it has in value. So if you want to make money more valuable, then don't have all that much of it. Don't print that many dollar bills, and what there are will actually grow in value. If you want to devalue money, just print them away. I remember Zimbabwe did that. I have in my files I think it's a $50 billion bill. It's worth absolutely nothing because they printed them like waste paper. And you can do the same thing with any currency. It's a matter of supply and demand. A second principle that Adam Smith had was the principle of laissez-faire economics, in which he said, if you want to see the economy grow and do well, just let it alone. It will do it on its own. Now, not everyone agrees with him, but he was, he had some points there that I think maybe have some validity, and that there are certain types of pressures that sort of eventually have a tendency to even themselves out when it comes to economics. The private ownership requires civil government because, after all, if there's no government to say that somebody owns something and somebody else can't come along and just take it, if you don't have that, then whoever's stronger gets to just come and take it. Remember the period of the Vikings where they were stronger than everybody else, so they were just coming and taking whatever they wished. And so civil government protects the right to ownership. Now, Thomas Malthus comes along a generation later, and he writes his essay on the principle of population. Building upon what Adam Smith says, Malthus points out that population will continue to rise and grow as long as the economy allows it, and that there's something, within that where if the economy, if the population grows outside, beyond its ability for the economy, and when I say economy, I'm not just talking about money, when population grows faster than the food can provide for those mouths, those new mouths to feed, then starvation will come, and eventually that will sort of even itself out too. So that a population can grow so large that eventually starvation will take root, and some of those people will die off, and the rest can continue at a more leisurely pace. And so population pressure will be evened out by the economics of being able to feed people. Of course, some of the things he theorized, you see, that was his theory. He assumed the population would go to a certain level. Turned out to be wrong in a number of cases because humans seem very adept at finding new ways again and again and again to feed people. For example, the advent of the potato in European markets meant a new source of food that people could grow. We're going to be looking, well, we already talked, I think, about Ireland, that went to a largely potato economy, and the population soared. Now, when a blight came and knocked out the potato crops, a great many people, millions, maybe 1 million people, actually perished of starvation. And so, in that sense, Malthus had a point. On the other hand, he said, the population is going to get so big, and he actually named a number. And by and large, we have far surpassed that number because we continue to find new ways to feed people, new forms of grain, new breeds of grain that we have found, that we have developed, and that can feed more and more people. And that accounts for India now having somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 billion in their population today. You say, well, how can that possibly be supported? Because these new inventions and these new breeds of grain and new ways to feed people continue to be developed. We mentioned the Irish potato famine, so let's continue on from there. Karl Marx, certainly the big name when it comes to communism. He was a German student of law and philosophy and moved to London where he met Engels, and they became sort of a team, worked with Friedrich Engels, and he comes out with several books. His first book is the Communist Manifesto. They're writing this together, but Marx usually gets most of the credit, either deserved or not. And also eventually Das Kapital he would come out with. Now, in his Communist Manifesto, he says that all of history is the story of a class struggle. There are the workers, and then there are the people that own everything, and they are always at odds. That the rich minority always oppresses the poor majority, and there's certain truths to what he says. Not going to deny some of his major points. What you do with that, I will have some issues with. Things will only change, he says, by means of violence. And again, I won't say that's always the case, but certainly violence sometimes, what is the old saying that violence never changed anything? Well, actually, sometimes it does change things. And so he envisioned that it would only be by revolution that any of this. Um, so his Communist Manifesto begins with these words: "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise, that is, to get rid of the specter, the Pope and the Tsar, Metternich," and he's mentioning people from his past, Guillotis, the French radicals, and German police spies. He goes on, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed." And I think there are some points to this. We can find this happening in history, but I would not say this is all of history. Notice he's saying that's the lens, and you have to look at everything through that lens. Well, we've seen other lenses as well. And by being multi-lensed in our approach, it has given us a better perspective, I believe, in history. He goes on to say these stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. So I'm not sure that always works out quite the way that he envisions. He summarizes then the theory of communism may be summed up in the single sentence. Here it is: the abolition of private property. Marx says if there's no private property, then everybody will be equal and everybody will be fine. Of course, if there's no private property, no one owns anything, and the government owns everything, and the government can be the greatest taskmaster of all, as we see when communism is first attempted in Russia. He concludes his manifesto with these words: "Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite." And of course, Marx envisioned, since he had moved to England, he had envisioned his communist revolution beginning in England, where that was the heart of the Industrial Revolution. That's where it had all begun. And he envisioned a revolution in England. It doesn't take place there. Instead, when it takes place, it's going to be in Russia, a very backwards country, a country that was very non-industrialized, the complete antithesis to what Marx supposed would take place. So here was his plan. He says a revolution must take place to destroy the existing order. It's not going to be voted into office. A dictator must take power and exercise complete dominion over every aspect of people's lives for this to take place. And then finally, he said, and then everybody lives happily ever after. That's the theory. Of course, that theory has never actually worked out. It's true that we've had revolutions, we've had dictators taking power, we've seen them seeking to exercise complete authority, complete dominion over every aspect of life, but we never seem to get to the part of everyone lives happily ever after. And so he sets forth several definitions. First of all, there are the proletariat. That's the worker who who doesn't own, maybe owns a little bit of property, but virtually none compared to aristocracy, compared to the rich and the ruling class. Secondly, there are the bourgeoisie, the materialist middle class who owns the means of production. Remember, we talked in a previous class about instead of the aristocracy, now you had the self-made men, the made men who made themselves and advanced themselves. And Marx sees them as the enemy because they own the means of production, but they're not doing all the work. They're having workers to do all the work. And so he had two more definitions. The Bolshevik, now that's really rather bizarre because the Bolshevik literally means the majority. And yet when we see the rise of the Bolsheviks, they're not going to be the majority. They'll actually be the minority, but they'll call themselves the majority. And then finally you have the Menshevik. These are the minority, although they're not necessarily going to be called that. All right, so he has a planned vision where the revolution overthrows the government and the dictator, or might be dictators plural, again, usually it's just one, again, because if there's two, then they can't always agree, and they'll eventually just be one. What was the movie said there can be only one? The dictator gains complete personal control over all personal choices, and there's collectivization where he gathers and he collects all of the property, all of the wealth, and then he distributes it to whom he wills. So if you own anything, whether it's land or food or anything, you have to give it to the government, and if you're lucky, they will give some of it back to you. And that's the essence of his vision, of Marx's vision of communism. And of course, at the end of the day, everybody's happy because they have something, at least in theory. As I said, it's not going to work out that well. But that's the theory. That was the dream that Marx passes on. Now, the first time we see it actually carried out is going to be Vladimir Lenin. Comes from a wealthy family, a family of money. His brother had been executed for a plot to assassinate the Tsar of Russia, and following this, he adopts the teachings of Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, and during World War II, he returns to Russia. Actually, the Germans pay his way and sneak him back into Russia after the Tsar is deposed in the February 1917 revolt. And then he subsequently leads a coup at the end of that year, October 1917, where there's been sort of a government trying to put things back together and sort of, okay, we're not going to have the Tsar. How can we run things? And then he leads a coup in October of that same year. And the first thing that he does is, which is why Germany had sent him there, he withdraws, because remember, World War I is taking place still during that time, and he withdraws Russia from World War I. So in that regard, Germany succeeds in that effort. Lenin goes on to take all of the lands which had belonged to the aristocracy and all of the lands that belong to the church, and he nationalizes them. Notice he's not giving them to individuals. This now belongs to the state. The press is restricted. In fact, anytime you look at a communist revolution, there will not be freedom of the press, because remember that Marx said the dictator has to exercise control over everything, including the press, including what people hear and see and know and believe. Laws now are replaced with a revolutionary conscience. I put that in quotes. And what that means is that we're going to do what is ever good for the revolution. We don't care if something's legal or illegal. We don't care if something's right or wrong. Does it advance the cause of the revolution? And now begins the Red Terror. Now the colors, red and white, are the armbands and sort of signets that those that were in favor of communism or those that were in favor of some other form of government. And so red here stands for communism. And we enter a phase of mass executions. And if people aren't executed, they are sent to the Gulag. These are forced labor camps, usually way out in the wilderness. We're going to see Siberia. I've actually met people who were sent to Siberia not necessarily during Lenin's time, but at later dates, that were sent there sometimes as children. Because their parents had done something wrong, and so they likewise were sent along with their parents to these forced labor camps to survive or to die, whatever it may be. Quoting James Gregor, he says, in dealing with the issue, Lenin was candid. So he's speaking about Lenin's, there's a quote where he quotes Lenin. He, that is Lenin, stated, one therefore cannot deny the justice of the remark that in Marxism itself, there is not a grain of ethics from beginning to end. Marxism does not claim to be ethical, because there is no such thing as ethics, because ethics would require a basis for ethics. There is no absolute, there is no God. Ethics becomes whatever is convenient to advance the cause of communism. Taraki says, and he again speaking from his vantage point in the revolution, Lenin taught us to be merciless toward the enemies of the revolution. And millions of people had to be eliminated in order to secure the victory of the October Revolution. The only way for communism to advance was for everyone who disagreed had to be put to death. And so Lenin takes power, and initially he's ruling as almost like a triumvirate, but in the end it will be a triumvirate of one. And so the revolution comes forth, and it is successful. And now we'll begin I'm going to call it the grand experiment. Of course, it's an experiment that will ultimately end in failure, and communism will eventually fall apart. Initially, remember, part of what it calls for is the abolition of private property. If you grow your own food, you can't keep that food. That belongs to someone else. And so the government will collect, and it will dole out what it decides to dole out. And there will be millions who die in famine who otherwise would have lived working their farms, but now they are no longer to work their farms. They're now to work the government farms, and the government will feed them or not feed them as it sees fit. Max Weber, a German sociologist, commented on this. He writes a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And he's the one who coins the term a Protestant work ethic. You see, he notes the difference between the communist ethic that it produces. And remember that communism says everybody works, and then the government pays you what it decides to pay you. So that if you work hard or if you work a little bit, it doesn't really matter. The government's going to take care of you. Now, the government didn't take care of a lot of people, so a lot of people starved. But in theory, at least, whatever you do, the government's going to take care of, and the government's going to own, and it will be both the rewarder and get the reward. And he looks instead at the idea that had come about not through Christianity, or not even necessarily through the Reformation, not deliberately at least, but something that had coincided with it. And he saw the success of capitalism as the unintended result of the Protestant Reformation. Not that the Reformation was about advancing capitalism, but that this was I don't know if we could call it a benefit, but a side result of that. And so, whereas communism would say that man works to live, in the Reformation, you had that idea that man lives to work, and by his work he glorifies God. Yes, he is saved through faith, by grace through faith. That was, remember, a hallmark of the Reformation. But Calvin points out, and Luther would agree with us, that man can glorify God not just by becoming a priest, not just by doing lots of Hail Marys and things like that, but in his everyday life. And in his work, he can also glorify God. And that all the way back in the Garden of Eden, when things were perfect, when things were utopia, God had put the first man into the garden, and he had put him in the garden to work it and to keep it, so that he was made to work, not just to live, but also that this was part of his life. Now, the economy of Protestantism As a result of, and this was, I think, especially true among the reformers, but in all Protestants, there was a tendency to promote literacy. After all, they were people of the book. You don't believe just what the Pope tells you to do. You don't just believe what the councils say. You read it in the Bible for yourself. So, and to read it in the Bible for yourself, you have to be able to read. And so it had promoted literacy, and that means that the Protestant work ethic had been based upon a Protestant word ethic, an ethic which called people to be able to read and write. Neil Ferguson, in his book Civilization, says that the Catholic Church acted as one of the brakes on economic development in South America. Because remember, in Roman Catholic theology, the Pope has the last say. You believe whatever the Pope and his hierarchy, all the way down to the priests, you believe what they tell you to do. In fact, in the early days before the Council of Trent in the 1960s, prior to that, the stance of the church was to urge people not to read the Bible for themselves. You say, is that true? Actually, I remember my mother telling me, who was raised in the Roman Catholic Church, where the priest would actually say to them, do not read the Bible for yourself, because if you read the Bible for yourself, you might end up believing something other than what the church teaches you. And actually, I think that might be true. Whereas in her case, she read the Bible for herself, and she said, wait a second, the Bible says something different than what the church has been teaching me. And so the Catholic Church, prior to, now this is going to change in the 1960s with Vatican II, but prior to that, they actually discouraged reading the scriptures, reading the Bible. David Ackman, speaking of the finding of Chinese scholars, and remember, China's going to go communist as well a bit later, and we'll discuss that in a future lecture. He says one of the things we Chinese scholars were asked to look into, what accounted for the success. In fact, the preeminence of the West, and he was speaking especially of America, their preeminence over the world. He goes on to say, we studied everything we could from historical, political, economic, and cultural perspective. At first, we thought it was because you Americans had more powerful guns than we had. He goes on to say, then we thought it was because you had the best political system. And next, we focused on the economic system. But in the past 20 years, we've realized that the heart of your culture is your religion. And he's speaking specifically of Christianity. He goes on to say, that is why the West is so powerful. The Christian moral foundation of social and cultural life was what made possible the emergence of capitalism and then the successful transition to democratic politics. He says, and he's speaking from Chinese scholars, he says, we don't have any doubt about this. Now, of course, it could be argued that America might have been built upon a Christian foundation, but how long has it kept that Christian foundation? And Ferguson, in his book Civilization that I've quoted earlier, points this out when he says the spirit of capitalism was bound to destroy its Protestant ethic parent. That it might have been the Protestant work ethic that brought about capitalism, but in turn it would be capitalism and its materialistic influence that would sound the death knell to a Christian culture. Now, in the 20th century, we have an age which started back in the 1800s. We saw revolutions in the 1800s. We saw revolution in the 1700s. But in the 20th century, 1900s, we have in Mexico, we have in China, in Russia, actually, not necessarily in that order, but we have a Chinese revolution, the Russian revolution, Cuba. I'm going to have a chart where I'm going to have to exclude Cuba just for space. More recently, Iran saw its revolution. There are certainly others as well. The Mexican Revolution actually started with a quest for political and land reforms, Pancho Villa. But you have China then with an attempt to establish Western democracy, but that changed and took on instead a communist flair, especially when the dust settled after World War II with Chairman Mao. And then you have the Russian Revolution that we've been looking at, a revolt against the Tsarist regime. And initially it wasn't communist, but then Lenin gave it that slant when he comes in, and so by October of 1917, we have communism, and of course that lasted up until the 1990s, and but that one failed as well. The Iranian Revolution more recently in 1979, this was an Islamic revolution against Western influence led by the Ayatollah Khomeini. The the vote's still out to see what's going to happen long term with that. But Peter Sines, a professor of George Mason University, makes the following observations, just in general, on revolutions. He points out that revolutions do not take place in a weak regime. Now, that sounds at first a little bit counterintuitive. You'd say, well, for a revolution to succeed, doesn't the regime have to be weak and upset? And that's true to a point. But if the regime had been weak all throughout, then there's no really reason to have a revolution. You can change things more gradually. But usually there's a strong regime that's oppressive, and that pushes the need for a revolution. Secondly, he points out that revolutions normally require a large group, or it doesn't have to be a majority, but a large group who believe that violence is legitimate. So there's got to be a significant group that's willing to revolt, not just in word, but in deed. That revolutions require a shared ideology, so that if you can have people willing to revolt, but they can't agree on what they're revolting about, it's not going to be very successful. It's going to fall apart. And finally, that each of these revolutions had a large outside influence. It wasn't just an internal. You say, wait a second, what about the American Revolution? Well, the American Revolution, the reason it succeeded is because France and Spain, France especially, were backing the American Revolution because they wanted to see England grow weaker. And so there's always an outside influence as well as an internal one.